The order came at 6 on a morning still black at the edges, and I remember it because I had just checked my watch and thought, 40 more minutes, and I am off my first solo post at last. I was 19. My name in the watch books was Ensign Wren Calloway, probationer, and I had been standing the east water gate of Harrowgate Palace for exactly 3 weeks. The east water gate is not a grand gate. It is the small one, tucked in the flank of the palace where the kitchens and the laundries and the medical wing led out onto a cobbled service court, a court the tourists never see and the cameras never point at. It is where the milk vans come, and the flower carts, and the men who take away the ash. They give the smallest gates to the newest guards because, they told me, nothing ever happens there. They were wrong about that. Everything happened there. But it did not happen to me. It happened around me, and the man it truly happened to was standing at my shoulder, and his name was Sergeant Halbrook. Sergeant Elias Halbrook had 31 years in the watch and, by the reckoning of every ensign who had ever passed under him, roughly 900 words. He was famous for it. He did not lecture. He did not tell stories in the guardroom. When a probationer did something foolish, he did not shout. He looked once, and the foolishness died of shame. He was a broad, still, gray-eyed man who wore his crimson tunic as if it had grown on him, and in 3 weeks I had heard him speak perhaps 30 sentences, most of them corrections, none of them cruel. I had begun to think of him as a kind of weather, a permanent, dependable pressure at the edge of my duty, like the cold off the river. That morning the cold off the river was very real. A freezing mist came up off the water and lay in the service court like spilled milk, and my breath hung in front of my face, and the single sodium lamp over the gate arch made a hard orange cone of light on the wet cobbles. Beyond the light, everything was gray and blue and beginning, very slowly, to think about being morning. At 6 a car came into the court. I want to be careful here, because I have told this story to serious men in serious rooms since, and I have learned that the details are the whole of it. So, it was a long black car, official in its lines but not one of ours, not a palace car, none of the small pennants, none of the plates the gatehouse keeps a list of. Behind it, sliding out of the mist a length back, came a second vehicle, and that one I did know the shape of, and the sight of it put a cold finger down my spine before my mind had caught up to why. It was an ambulance. A private one, no crown, no county markings, plain white with a thin blue line, the kind a hospital does not own, and a family with money hires by the day. An ambulance at the East Water Gate, at 6 in the morning, with no call logged and no notice given. The black car stopped at the very edge of my light. A driver got out and opened the rear door with the smooth, practiced deference of a man who opens doors for a living, and out of the car unfolded a person I had seen exactly twice in my 3 weeks, both times at a distance, both times being deferred to. I knew him at once by the chain. He wore, over a charcoal morning coat cut close and expensive, a heavy gold chain of office, flat links the size of walnuts, and a badge on his breast worked in enamel and gilt, the twin keys and the coiled measuring cord that marked the office of the Controller of Household Progresses. That is a real title in our palace, or rather it was. It belonged to the man who arranged every journey the royal family made, the cars, the trains, the routes, the timings, the beds slept in and the doors gone through. If the Queen went from one house to another, this office moved her. If the young prince rode out to open a bridge, this office had timed it to the minute. It is not a glamorous office. It is a powerful one, in the quiet way that logistics is always powerful. The man who controls how people move controls, in the end, where they can and cannot be. His name was Sir Aldous Marrow, and I had heard him called in the guardroom the clockmaker, because he ran the family's movements like a clock, and because, they said, he had never in 20 years been a minute late for anything, nor allowed anyone else to be. He was perhaps 60, silver-haired, with a long, clean-shaven face and pale eyes that moved over a scene the way a surveyor's level moves over a wall, measuring, finding it wanting. He carried a slim document case of oxblood leather. He wore, I noticed, gloves of gray kid, very fine, and I noticed it because a man does not usually keep his gloves on to hand over a paper. He crossed my cone of light and came to the gate, and he looked at Sergeant Halbrook, and then, dismissively, the way you glance at a bollard, he looked at me, and then he looked back at Halbrook and he spoke. "Sergeant, I have a matter of the household. It is time critical and it is confidential, and I will need this gate opened and the medical passage cleared to the nursery stair. Now, if you please." His voice was pleasant and very sure, the voice of a man who has given 10,000 instructions and had 10,000 of them obeyed. Behind him the ambulance idled, and I could see now that its rear doors were already standing open, and its interior was dark, and I looked, because something in me was already looking for wrong things. Its interior was empty. No attendant sat in it. No nurse, no stretcher made up and ready, just the dark box of it waiting. Sergeant Halbrook did not move. He did not, that I could see, even change. He stood as he had stood, square in the middle of the gateway with his rifle slung and his gloved hands at his sides, and he regarded Sir Aldous Marrow with the mild, unhurried attention he gave to everything, from a milk van to a mist, to a 19-year-old ensign shivering at her post. "Sir Aldous," he said, "what is the matter of the household?" It was, I thought at the time, a strange way to answer. Not "I'll need to see authorization," which is what the standing orders would have had me say. Not "one moment, sir, I'll ring the gatehouse." Just, "What is the matter of the household?" As if he had all the morning in the world, and the man before him had come to tell him something, and he was ready to listen. Marrow's clean face tightened, very slightly at the corners. He was not a man accustomed to being asked to explain himself at a service gate by a sergeant. "The matter," he said, "is Her Royal Highness the Princess Maelin, and it is not, sergeant, a matter for the gate. I will say only what you need in order to do your part, and your part is to open this passage. Her Highness is unwell. Gravely, quietly unwell, a condition of the nerves and the blood that Her Majesty has, understandably, wished kept from the household and from the press. On the advice of physicians she is to be removed this morning, before the palace wakes and before there can be any distress or spectacle, to a private clinic where she can be cared for properly and privately. The arrangements are mine. The ambulance is mine. The authority," and here he opened the oxblood case and drew out a single stiff cream sheet folded once, and held it up, not offering it, simply showing it. The way a man shows a badge he does not intend to let you handle, the authority is the Crown's. I saw the paper. I saw a heavy red seal at its foot and dark ink, and at the head of it, in a printed hand, words I could read even at that distance, and in that light because they were large and they were meant to be read. "Warrant of protective custody." And under them, smaller, "By order of the household, for the person of a minor of the blood royal." And I felt, standing there, the whole shape of my 3 weeks of training desert me, because here was a great officer of the household with the crown seal, telling me that a little girl was sick and had to be moved gently and secretly for her own good. And every rule I had been given said that a king's guard obeys the lawful orders of the household. And I did not know, God help me. I was 19 and it was 6 in the morning and there was a seal on the paper. I did not know that it was a lie. But Sergeant Halbrook knew. I did not understand yet how he knew. That would come later in pieces, and some of the pieces I only assembled years afterward, sitting with the man himself over a pot of tea in his small stone cottage, the medals in a drawer and the story finally, slowly, coming out of him a sentence at a time. But at that gate, at 4.5 minutes past 6, I saw him know. It was nothing you could have photographed. It was a settling. It was the way a man's weight changes when he decides he is not going to be moved. A change that happens somewhere below the knees and the breastbone, and does not touch the face at all. He looked at the warrant. He looked, without hurry, at the ambulance with its open dark doors and its empty belly, and he looked back at Sir Aldous Marrow, and he asked the first of the questions. I have thought a great deal since about the questions. People who tell this story, and it has been told more than I would like, and mostly wrongly, people say Halbrook asked one chilling question, and the whole scheme fell apart. That is a good line for a headline, and it is not quite true. He asked several questions. But there was one among them, one quiet sentence, that I watched land in Sir Aldous Marrow like a stone dropped into a deep, still well, a question that seemed to fall and never touch bottom, and that changed the color of the man's face while it was still falling. But that was the last question. This was the first, and it was gentle, and it was this. "Sir Aldous," said Sergeant Halbrook, "who is the nurse?" Marrow blinked. "I beg your pardon." "The nurse," Halbrook said again, unhurried, and he lifted one gloved hand a few inches and tilted it, not quite pointing, toward the idling ambulance behind the great man's shoulder. "A gravely sick child, moved before dawn under a physician's advice. There will be a nurse to receive her or a physician in the ambulance. Which is the nurse? I don't see them." And I looked at the ambulance again, and its doors stood open on nothing. And for the first time that morning, I felt the cold in the court change into a different kind of cold. That is where it began, with an empty ambulance and a quiet man asking who was going to hold the child's hand. But to tell you how it ended, and why by 7 o'clock that morning the whole of Harrowgate was awake and standing, and Sir Aldous Marrow was sitting on an upturned crate under guard with his gold chain of office taken from around his neck, I have to take you back, only a little way back, to the week before, and to the small, strange things that Sergeant Halbrook had already seen and said nothing about, and stored, the way he stored everything, against the moment he would need it. I did not know it that morning, but Sergeant Halbrook had been watching Sir Aldous Marrow for 11 days. He told me so, years later in the cottage, in his flat, unhurried way, as if it were the most natural thing in the world and not the thing that saved a child's life. "You watch the gate," he said. "But the gate is not the wall and the door. The gate is everything that comes to it. 11 days before, a thing came to my gate that did not belong there, and I put it in the back of my mind, and I turned it over at night the way you turn a coin you are not sure is real. The thing was a van. 11 days before that black morning, on an ordinary gray afternoon, a plain van had come into the service court to deliver, its papers said, medical fittings for the West Nursery refurbishment. Halbrook had signed it in, as he signed in 100 vans, and thought nothing of it except that a corner of his mind, the corner that never quite went off duty, noted two small wrong things. The first was that the West Nursery was not being refurbished. He knew the fabric of the palace the way he knew his own hands, and there was no work order posted, no dust sheets, no smell of paint, no scaffolders' passes issued. The second was smaller still. The men who unloaded the van unloaded it into a ground-floor store beside the medical wing, not up to any nursery, and among the crates Halbrook, who had once in another life spent 2 years as a medical orderly in a field hospital and had good reason to know the shape of such things, saw the unmistakable frame of a bed restraint, the padded cuffs and the buckled straps of the kind used, lawfully and kindly, on patients who are a danger to themselves, and used unlawfully and cruelly on people who are a danger to no one at all. "Medical fittings," Halbrook said to me over the tea, turning the phrase in his mouth. It was true in its way. They were medical fittings. That is the cleverness of a good lie ensign. It hides inside a true thing. He had not raised an alarm. He had nothing to raise it on. A bed restraint is not a crime. A store is not a plot. A man of Halbrook's rank does not go about accusing the controller of household progresses of God knows what on the strength of a padded cuff seen through the slats of a crate. But he had done what he always did, which was to remember and to watch, and to let the questions gather. And in the 11 days, more had gathered. He had noticed that Sir Aldous Marrow, who never came to the East Water Gate, had come to it 3 times, always at odd hours, always on foot, always alone, always with the oxblood case, always to look at the medical passage and the store and the ambulance turning space, and to stand a moment and to leave. Halbrook had greeted him each time with perfect courtesy and watched him each time with perfect attention, and had seen a man rehearsing. A man walks a route before he needs to use it, Halbrook said, the way a soldier walks the ground before the battle. He was walking his ground. I did not know yet what the battle was. But I knew he was going to fight one here, at my gate, and I knew he thought he had already won it. He had noticed one more thing, and this was the thing that turned his uneasiness into something colder and more certain, though he still had no proof and no power to act. He had noticed the princess. Princess Maelin was 8 years old that winter, a small, grave, watchful child, dark-haired like her mother the queen, with a way of standing very straight when she was frightened that Halbrook, who also stood very straight when he was frightened, had come to recognize. She was not a loud child. She did not run and shriek in the courts the way her brother Prince Joran did, 10 years old and full of thunder. Maelin walked. Maelin observed. Maelin, Halbrook had noticed over the autumn, had taken to walking. On the mornings she was allowed out before her lessons, along the inner wall that overlooked the service court, and to stopping, always at the same place, above the east water gate and looking down at him. She never waved, Halbrook told me. She never called out. A princess is taught better than that, and she was a well-taught child. But she came most mornings, and she stood above my gate, and she looked down, and after a while I understood that she was checking. She was checking that I was there. A child does not check that a man is there unless she has begun to be afraid that one morning he will not be, and unless, for some reason she cannot say, his being there has come to matter to her. He had not known why. But he had begun, in his flat and patient way, to make it his business that he would always be there when she looked. He had traded shifts to keep the dawn watch at the east water gate. He had, without ever saying so to a soul, appointed himself the thing the frightened child was checking for. So when the black car came out of the mist at 6:04, and Sir Aldous Marrow crossed the light with a warrant in an oxblood case and an empty ambulance at his back, and told a sergeant that the little girl above the gate was sick and must be taken away in secret before the palace woke, Sergeant Halbrook was not, as I had been, ambushed. He had been waiting 11 days for a man to come and tell him that lie. He had only been waiting to hear which shape the lie would take. Now he had heard it, and he asked about the nurse. "There is a nurse," said Sir Aldous Marrow, "at the clinic." It was a good answer. It was a quick answer, and quick answers are what an honest man gives, and I felt myself want to believe it, the way you want to believe the man who has the seal and the chain and the certainty. But Sergeant Halbrook only inclined his head a fraction, as if filing the answer away next to a great many other filed things, and said, mildly, "At the clinic, not in the ambulance." "The ambulance is a conveyance, Sergeant, not a ward. The attendant will meet us." Then the ambulance carries a sick child, gravely sick, before dawn, along a public road with a driver and no one else. Halbrook said it without any edge at all. He said it the way a man reads back an order to be sure he has it right. "That's a strange way to move a sick child, Sir Aldous. I've moved a few. You put the nurse in with them, always, because the road is where they take the turn for the worse. Any orderly knows it. Any physician knows it. The men who signed your warrant would know it. Why don't they?" And there, do you see it, was the first crack so fine you could have missed it. Marrow had said a physician had advised the removal. Halbrook had just gently pointed out that no physician who had actually advised it would have advised it done this way. The paper said one thing, the empty ambulance said another, and an empty ambulance does not lie. Marrow's pale eyes did something then, a small flick down and to the side, the smallest recalculation, and he covered it at once with impatience. Good, loud, official impatience, the kind that is meant to end a conversation. "Sergeant Halbrook," he said, and now the pleasantness had a floor of iron under it. "I have indulged this because you have a duty and I respect it, but your duty is not to physic the child. Your duty is to obey a lawful order of the household, presented under seal by an officer of my standing. I am now presenting it. You will clear the passage. Or you will be the man, the one man, the sergeant at the water gate, who obstructed the crown's own physicians in the care of a sick princess, and delayed her treatment and did her harm. Think very carefully, sergeant, about which of those men you wish to be by 7 o'clock this morning. It was, I have to tell you, a masterful thing to say, and I felt it land on me even though it was not aimed at me. It took every good instinct a guard has: obedience, humility, the horror of harming a child, the horror of being the jumped-up nobody who defies his betters and is proved a fool, and it turned every one of them into a rope and threw them all around Harrowgate at once. Clear the passage or you hurt the child. Clear the passage or you are the arrogant sergeant who thought he knew better than the crown's physicians. There was no good way to say no. That was the beauty of it. Marrow had built the trap so that refusing looked exactly like the crime. I looked at Sergeant Halbrook to see him yield. I am ashamed to write it, but I did. He was one man and old, and I was 19 and did not yet know what one still man is worth. He did not yield. He asked the second question. Sir Aldous, he said, may I read the warrant? Now that is not a question. That is a right. The standing orders of the watch are plain on the point, and I had learned them in my first week. No king's guard clears a passage, opens a gate, or stands aside from a charge on the strength of a paper he has been shown but not permitted to read. A paper shown and not read is a magician's card. The whole of the law lives in the reading. And Halbrook, by phrasing his right as a request, had done a subtle and a deadly thing. He had made it impossible for Marrow to refuse without confessing. Because an honest man hands over the warrant. An honest man, at that word, steps forward and puts the paper in the sergeant's gloved hand and says, read it, read every word, read it twice. Only a man with something to hide keeps a warrant in the air, at arm's length, shown but never surrendered. Marrow did not hand over the warrant. He drew it back an inch, the smallest movement, a flinch of the wrist, and he said smoothly, it is a confidential instrument concerning a minor of the blood. It is not for general handling. You may see that it bears the seal. That is what the orders require of you, sergeant, and no more, to see that it is sealed. That isn't what the orders require, said Halbrook. He said it without triumph, almost with regret, the way you correct a man you had hoped would not force you to correct him. I know the orders, sir. I have kept them 31 years. They require me to read a warrant before I act on it and to satisfy myself by reading that it is what it claims to be: the right seal, the right signatures, the right form, the date, and the hand that signed it. A seal seen across a yard in a bad light is not a warrant read. You know that. You have moved this family under 1,000 warrants. You have never once let a man act on one he was only shown. Why this one? And I watched Sir Aldous Marrow's certainty do something it plainly had not done in years. I watched it hesitate. He had built his whole approach on speed, on arriving before the palace woke, on overwhelming a probationer and a stolid old sergeant with rank and seal, and the fear of harming a child, on being through the gate and away with his prize before anyone with the standing to stop him was even out of bed. Speed was the whole plan, and a still man asking quiet questions is the one thing speed cannot get past. Every question was a stone laid in the road. Marrow could not drive around them, and he could not, without confessing, sweep them away. And then Sir Aldous Marrow did the thing that a man does when the quiet questions have begun to bite, and he needs, suddenly, a second voice on his side of the gate. He half-turned toward the black car and lifted 2 fingers, a small summoning gesture, and the far door of the car opened, and a man got out whom I had not seen before, because he had been sitting in the dark of the back seat the whole while, waiting to be needed. He was a soft, prosperous-looking man of 50 or so, in a good overcoat, with a leather physician's bag in one hand and a stethoscope collar of self-importance about him, the manner of a man used to being the cleverest person in any sick room. He came forward into the edge of my lamplight and stood at Marrow's shoulder, and Marrow said, with the relief of a man playing a card he has kept in reserve, "This is Dr. Pettigore. He is a physician of 30 years standing, and it is on his certificate that this removal proceeds. Doctor, tell the surgeon. Tell him the nature of Her Highness's condition, so that we may end this delay." And Dr. Pettigore drew himself up and began, in the fruity carrying voice of a man giving evidence, to describe an illness. He spoke of a nervous crisis, of a disorder of the blood and the humors, of night terrors and a danger to the self, of the urgent clinical necessity. He used those words, urgent clinical necessity, of removing the patient to a controlled setting before the excitement of the waking household should precipitate a collapse. It was a good performance. It had Latin in it. It had the awful authority that a confident doctor's voice carries over ordinary people, the authority that makes you doubt your own eyes and hand over your own child, and I felt it work on me exactly as it was meant to. Felt the last of my certainty sliding, thought, perhaps she is ill, perhaps they are right, perhaps the old surgeon and I are about to do a terrible wrong to a sick little girl out of stubbornness and pride. Sergeant Halbrook let him finish. He let him finish every word courteously, the way he let everyone finish. And then he asked Dr. Pettigore one question, and it was not about medicine at all. "Doctor," he said, "when did you last examine Her Highness?" Pettigore hesitated, a beat, only a beat, but I had learned in the last few minutes to watch for that beat. "I recently, within the week. Here at the palace. At a consulting room, she was brought to me." "Brought to you," said Halbrook mildly. "Her Highness the Princess Maelin was taken out of Harrowgate Palace within the week to a private consulting room to be examined by you, and no one in her household knows of it. Not her governess, who ran to that wall just now half-dressed and weeping. Not her mother the Queen, who your warrant says advised the removal, but who, I would wager my pension, is asleep in her bed and knows nothing of any of this. A princess of the blood does not leave this palace without 40 people knowing the hour and the route and the car. I keep the gate she would have left by. She did not leave by it. She has not left by any gate. You have never examined her, doctor. You have never been in a room with her in your life." The soft, prosperous face of Dr. Pettigore came apart very slowly, like something left out in the rain, and he did not answer, and his silence was the second confession of that morning. And I understood then, fully, coldly, all the way down, what I was standing in the middle of. Not a hard case, not a genuine doubt, not a sick child and an anxious household. A performance. A troop of paid men in the dark with a forged paper and an empty ambulance, come to carry off a little girl who had done nothing but be born one place too high in a line of succession, and to do it so smoothly, so lawfully, so early, that no one would ever be able to point to the moment a crime had been done. And it had very nearly worked. That is the thing I have never been able to shake in all the years since. It was not a clumsy plot. It was a beautiful one. If any other guard had held that gate, if I had held it alone, God forgive me, the passage would have been cleared, and the ambulance would have taken her, and the doctor's certificate and the Queen's forged hand would have carried her past every checkpoint between here and the private clinic. And by the time the household woke and the alarm was raised, she would have been a fact, a sad established fact, a frail princess already under care, and the untangling of it might have taken months, and might never have come all the way undone. It failed because of one man's eyes. That is a very thin thread for a child's whole life to hang by. I have thought about that thread every working morning of my life since, standing my own gates. Marrow saw it going. He saw the doctors collapse, and he saw that the quiet questions had now taken 2 of his men down in front of a probationer, and he did the only thing left to a man in his position, which was to stop arguing and start commanding, to throw away persuasion and reach for pure force of rank, and to aim it, since Halbrook would not bend, at the one soft place left in that gateway. He turned deliberately, dismissively, away from Halbrook and toward me. "You," he said, "Ensign, what is your name?" Calloway, sir, I said, and I hated how young my voice sounded in the cold. Ensign Calloway, you are new. You have your career before you. You have seen an officer of the household present a sealed warrant for the care of a sick child, and you have seen a sergeant, an old man 3 months from his pension, obstructed out of stubbornness. When this is looked into, Ensign, and it will be looked into, there will be 2 kinds of guard remembered from this gate, the one who understood her duty and the one who did not. I am giving you the chance now to open this passage yourself and be the first kind. Do it, and none of the sergeant's foolishness need touch you at all. I want to tell you I answered him bravely. I did not answer him at all. My mouth was dry and my heart was going, and the whole weight of him, the chain, the seal, the certainty, the terrible reasonable-sounding threat was on me, and I stood there frozen, a 19-year-old girl with a rifle she had never fired in anger, and I did not know what to do. And Sergeant Halbrook, without turning his head, without raising his voice, said one thing to me, not to Marrow, to me. Ensign Calloway, ring the gatehouse bell, the long ring, then stand where you are and open nothing. The long ring. I knew what it was. Every probationer learns it in the first week and prays never to have cause to use it. 3 ordinary rings summon the relief. 6 rings the fire. But the long ring, one long unbroken pull of the bell that does not stop until a hand takes it off you, the long ring is the alarm of the whole palace watch, and it means a guard at a post believes there is a present danger to the person of the royal family, and requires every man who can hear it. It cannot be given lightly. A guard who gives it wrongly is finished. And a sergeant who orders a probationer to give it has put his 31 years and his pension, and his name on the scales against a warrant with the crown's own seal. And if he is wrong, if the paper is real and the child is truly sick, he has committed the gravest folly of his life in front of the whole household, and no explaining will save him. Sir Aldous Marrow understood this. I saw him understand it. And I saw the certainty come back into his face like blood into a white knuckle, because he thought, I am sure he thought, that Halbrook had just made the one mistake that would destroy him, and that he had only to let the old fool ring his bell and be proved a hysteric, and the warrant would carry, and the ambulance would go. Ring it, Marrow said to me, and he almost smiled. By all means, ring your bell and let the household come and see who has been playing the fool at the water gate. I looked at Halbrook. He did not look at me. He was watching Marrow, and his gray eyes were perfectly steady, and he gave me, very slightly, one nod. I put my hand on the bell rope, and I pulled the long ring. You have not heard the long ring, and I hope you never do, and I will not be able to make you feel it in words. It is a big, deep, iron sound, and it does not stop, and it goes out over the whole of Harrowgate in the black and blue dawn, off the water and off the stone, and it wakes things. It woke that morning a palace that thought nothing ever happened at the East Water Gate, and one by one, and then in a flood, the palace answered it. The first to come was the relief guard from the guardhouse 40 yards off, 2 men at a dead run with their rifles up, and behind them the duty corporal, and then the whole off-watch section spilling out half-dressed and buckling on as they ran, because the long ring pulls every man who can hear it, whether he is on duty or in his bed. Within 90 seconds there were 9 King's Guards in that service court, and the empty orange cone of my lamp was empty no longer, and Sir Aldous Marrow's smooth, solitary arrival had become something he had very much not planned. A crowd. A crowd of the one kind of men his whole scheme had depended on, their not being men with the standing to ask questions and the discipline to wait for answers. He recovered fast, I will give him that. He turned to the duty corporal, a hard, competent man named Sergeant Corporal Vane, and he did the whole thing again, the chain and the seal and the sick child and the warrant, faster now and harder, and he added a new note, a note of outrage, that a probationer had rung the palace alarm against the crown's own physicians, that this was a scandal, that heads would answer for it, that the passage must be cleared this instant before real harm was done to Her Highness. and I watched Corporal Vane begin to waver, because Vane did not know what Halbrook knew. Vane had come running to an alarm and found the controller of household progresses standing there with a sealed warrant in a plausible fury, and a probationer white as milk, and old Halbrook saying nothing, because Halbrook had stopped talking the moment the crowd arrived, and I did not understand why, and it frightened me. Vane looked from the great officer to the old surgeon, and I could see the calculation on him, the terrible pull of rank and seal, and I thought, it is going to work. He built the trap so well that even the men who came to spring it are going to walk into it. That was the midpoint of the morning, though I did not know to call it that. The moment it looked as if the alarm itself had been a mistake, as if bringing the whole watch had only brought a larger audience to Halbrook's ruin. Marrow had turned even the answer to his scheme into a part of his scheme, and still Halbrook said nothing. Then he broke his silence, and when he broke it, he did not speak to Marrow, or to Vane, or to me. He spoke past all of us up into the gray air above the gate, in a voice I had not heard him use, not loud but pitched and carrying, a parade ground voice kept in reserve for 31 years. "Your Highness," he said, "come to the wall, please, where I can see you." And every man in that court looked up. She was already there. Princess Maelin was standing on the inner wall above the east water gate, in her nightgown and a coat someone had thrown over her, small and straight and dark against the paling sky, and she had, I realized, been there for some time, since before the bell, perhaps since before the car, because a watchful child who checks each morning that her guard is at his post, had been at her window when a black car came out of the mist, and had known, in the wordless certain way that frightened children know things, exactly what it had come for. "I'm here," she called down. Her voice was thin in the cold, but it did not shake. "I'm here, Sergeant Halbrook." "You are, Your Highness," said Halbrook. "Thank you, now stay just there, don't come down. Whatever any person says to you, whatever paper any person shows you, you don't come down off that wall, and you don't go to any door until your mother the Queen comes and takes your hand herself. Can you do that for me?" "Yes," said the princess. "Good," said Halbrook, and then in the same carrying voice to the whole court, but with his gray eyes fixed on Sir Aldous Marrow, "There is the sick child, gentlemen, there she stands. Grave nervous illness, disorder of the blood, too ill to be seen, too ill to wake the palace, so ill she must be taken in secret before dawn." He let it sit. "She walked to that wall on her own 2 feet, and she called down to me in a clear voice, and she is standing straighter than any man in this court, Corporal Vane. In your judgment, you have children, is that a child too sick to wait 1/2 hour for her mother?" And Corporal Vane, looking up at the small straight figure on the wall, stopped wavering. That was the turn of the tide, though the battle was not yet won, because Sir Aldous Marrow still had his warrant, and rank is rank, and a sealed instrument of the household is not overthrown by a sergeant's opinion that a child looks well. Marrow drew himself up, and his voice when it came was cold and clear and dangerous, and he played the last strong card he had. "A child may look well and be gravely ill within," he said. "That is the nature of the illness. You are guardsmen, not physicians. You will not stake this princess's health on your untrained eyes. The warrant stands. It is signed by Her Majesty's own hand and sealed with the household seal, and I will read you now the operative clause, so that every man here understands that to obstruct it further is to defy the Queen." And he opened the oxblood case again, and drew out the cream sheet, and this time, because the crowd required it, because you cannot merely wave a paper at 9 men and a corporal, this time he began, slowly, to read it aloud. He read the heading. He read the recitals, the whereas of the physician's advice, the whereas of the princess's condition, the grant of custody of her person to the bearer for the purpose of removal to a place of care. He read the date. He read the attestation. And he came at the last to the signature, and he read that too, in a voice of ringing authority. "Given under my hand at Harrowgate this day. Saralind R. signed," said Sir Aldous Marrow, lowering the paper and sweeping the court with his pale eyes, "by the Queen." And it was then, into the little silence after the Queen's name, with the warrant read out in full at last, and lying open now in the great officer's gray-gloved hand for any man to see, it was then that Sergeant Halbrook asked the last question, the quiet one, the one they put in the headlines and mostly get wrong. He did not raise his voice. If anything, he lowered it so that the 9 men leaned in to hear, and the princess on the wall went still to catch it, and Sir Aldous Marrow, who had read his warrant and won his crowd and thought the thing was as good as done, bent his head half an inch, unwilling, to hear what the old sergeant could possibly have left to say. "Sir Aldous," said Halbrook, "you say Her Majesty signed that warrant with her own hand here at Harrowgate this day." A pause, one breath, the mist curling between them. "Then why is the ink not dry?" The court went silent the way a struck bell goes silent when you close your hand around it. I did not understand in that first instant what he meant. I do not think Corporal Vane did either. But I understood that something enormous had happened, because I was looking at Sir Aldous Marrow's face, and I watched the blood go out of it. I have to stop the morning here for a moment and tell you what Halbrook had seen, because I did not see it, and I have never forgotten the patience it took to see it. When Marrow had first held up the warrant at arm's length in the orange lamplight, Halbrook had looked at it, you remember, and I had thought he was only looking at the seal. He was not. He was looking at the ink of the signature at the foot, the Saralind R, and he had seen, in the hard low light of the sodium lamp, a thing you can only see in a hard low light, and only if you have spent 31 years learning to look at the small true things while other men look at the big loud ones. He had seen the signature shine. Wet ink shines. Dry ink does not. A signature written days ago, or even hours ago, is matte and dead and part of the paper. A signature written minutes ago still holds a thread of gloss along the downstrokes where the ink lies thickest, a faint wet gleam that catches a low light and moves as the paper moves. Halbrook had seen that gleam on the Saralind R at 4.5 minutes past 6 in the morning, and he had known, then and there, with the cold certainty of a man who has just watched a lie identify itself, that the Queen's signature on that warrant had been put there within the last few minutes in the car, most likely in the dark, on the way to the gate, by a hand that was not the Queen's. Because the warrant said given under my hand at Harrowgate this day, it claimed the Queen had signed it. But the Queen, if she had signed such a thing, would have signed it in her study, or her sitting room, with her own pen at some civilized hour, and the ink would have been dry as dust long before dawn. Wet ink at 6 in the morning at a service gate meant one thing, and one thing only. The signature had been forged, freshly on the way, by the man who carried it, and he had not reckoned, in the dark of his car, on there being a sergeant at the gate who would look at the shine of ink instead of the size of a seal. He forged it well, Halbrook told me years later over the tea. It was a beautiful forgery. If he had made it the day before and let it dry, I would have had to find some other thread to pull, and I would have there were others. The empty ambulance was one, the bed restraints were another. The whole thing was rotten and would have come apart somewhere. But he was too clever. He wanted it perfect. He wanted to be able to say, signed this day at Harrowgate, so that no one could say the warrant was stale or the Queen had changed her mind since. So he signed it fresh that morning in the car. And a fresh lie shines, ensign. That is the one thing a liar can never quite dry in time. A fresh lie shines. That is what the question was. That is why it was chilling, though there was nothing in it a stranger would have found frightening, just an old man asking quietly why the ink was not dry. It was chilling because it could not be answered. There is no honest answer to why the Queen's day-old signature is still wet at dawn. There is no misunderstanding to clear up, no clarification to offer, no paper to produce. The question is a closed door with the guilty man on the wrong side of it, and everyone in that court, watching Marrow's face, understood in the space of 3 seconds that the door had just shut. I learned much later why Sergeant Halbrook of all men could read a signature by its shine, Why the trick of wet ink and dry was in his hands and not only in his head. And it belongs here, in the held breath before Marrow answered, because it is the thing that made the whole morning possible, and because it is the kind of thing a man never tells you until he is very old and the roses are finished. Before the watch, before the crimson tunic, before any of the 31 years, Elias Halbrook had been a young orderly in a field hospital in a bad war in a far place, and one of his duties there had been the paperwork of the dying. When a man was brought in past saving, someone had to take down his last words for his family, and his particulars, and get his mark or his signature on the small forms that let the army send his effects and his pay home to whoever was waiting. Halbrook had held the pen for a great many dying men, and steadied a great many failing hands, and watched a great many last signatures go down onto damp paper in bad light in the small hours. And he had learned, in that terrible school, everything there is to know about the way ink behaves. How it pools and how it dries, how a strong hand lays it and how a dying one drags it, how fresh ink shines and old ink goes to mat, how a signature made 10 minutes ago is a different creature under a lamp than a signature made the day before. I have watched more ink dry than any forger alive, he told me over the tea in his flat, unhurried voice, and it was the closest he ever came to boasting, and it was not a boast, it was a grief. Every one of those signatures was a man I couldn't save. I hated the pen. I hated the little forms. But you do not spend 2 years watching men sign their last name in the dark without your eyes learning the language of it forever, whether you want them to or not. So when a great officer held up a warrant in a bad orange light at 6 in the morning, and told me the Queen had signed it the day before, my eyes knew he was lying before the rest of me had even finished being afraid of him. They saw the shine. They have been seeing the shine my whole life. It is the one thing that war left in my hands that ever did anybody any good. I have thought about that a great deal in the years since, that the very thing which had cost that gentle grim man the most, the wet ink dark and the dying hands and the little forms he hated, was the thing that let him, one cold morning, save a living child. There is a lesson in it somewhere about what our worst days leave in our hands, and how it waits there, and how you never know until the morning it is needed which of your old wounds is going to turn out to be the tool that saves someone. I do not have the wording of the lesson. I only have Halbrook on one knee in a great hall and a little girl and the shine of ink. That is my whole theology. It has been enough. But all of that I learned later over the tea, a sentence at a time. At the gate, in the held breath, I knew none of it. I only knew that an old surgeon had asked why the ink was not dry, and that a great officer of the household had gone the color of the mist. For a long moment Sir Aldous Marrow said nothing at all, and the saying of nothing was the loudest thing I have ever heard. Then he tried. Of course he tried. A man like that does not fall in one breath. He said, and his voice had lost its lovely certainty and come out thin, the ink is a nonsense. Paper picks up damp. It is a cold morning off the river. Any paper will bead in this air. It's a cold morning, Halbrook agreed. Bring the paper here then, Sir Aldous, and let Corporal Vane and I look at it in the lamp, the two of us, and if it is damp river air along the whole sheet, we will beg your pardon and clear your passage this minute. But if the wet is only along the letters of the Queen's name and the rest of the sheet is dry, then it is not the river, is it? Then it is a signature written on the way here. Bring it to the lamp. And that was the second door closing, because now the challenge was concrete and public and easy. Hand the paper to 2 guardsmen and let them look in front of everyone at whether the wet was on the whole sheet or only on the name. An honest man does it in a heartbeat. Marrow could not do it. If he brought it to the lamp, they would see. If he refused to bring it to the lamp, everyone would know why he refused. He stood with the warrant in his gray-gloved hand, and he could neither surrender it nor keep it, and his silver head turned, once, toward the black car and the open door of it, and I understood with a lurch that he was thinking of running. Corporal Vane understood it too. Close the court, Vane said quietly, and 2 guardsmen moved without hurry to stand between Sir Aldous Marrow and his car, and 2 more to the ambulance, and the driver of the ambulance, a heavy man who had been sitting very still through all of this, put both his hands on the wheel where everyone could see them, which is the oldest confession there is. "Sir Aldous Marrow," said Corporal Vane, in the flat, formal voice of a man reading a caution, "I am detaining you and your party here on the authority of the watch until Her Majesty's household can be roused and the truth of this warrant established. You will surrender that document to me unopened and unaltered. You will surrender your case, and you will sit down." "You do not have the authority," Marrow said, but he said it to no one, the way a man says the last line of an argument he has already lost. "At the East Water Gate, sir," said Corporal Vane, "at 6 in the morning, with a forged warrant in your hand and an empty ambulance at your back, and a princess on the wall who is not sick. I have all the authority there is." They roused the palace properly then, and the household came, not at a run. The great household does not run, but fast and grim and growing. The master of the household came in a coat over his nightshirt with 2 footmen behind him. The keeper of the Privy Seal came, an old lawyer with a bald head and terrible eyes, and asked to see the warrant, and looked at it in the lamp for a long time, and looked at the wet along the Queen's name, and said nothing, which from a lawyer is a great deal. The princess's own governess came at a stumbling run and stood beneath the wall with her arms up and her face streaming, and would not go until she had seen the child was safe. And the princess, who had stood her ground on that cold wall for the better part of an hour exactly as Halbrook had asked her to, called down, "I'm all right, Miss Ansell. The surgeon said stay, so I stayed." And I saw 3 hard-grown men in that court turn their faces away. And then at 10 minutes to 7, with the sky gone from black to a bruised silver and the first true light coming up off the river, the Queen came. I had never seen Queen Saralind close. I had seen her in the way a probationer sees the sovereign, at a distance, in a car, on a balcony, a figure to salute. Now she came into the service court on foot, in a dark coat, with her dark hair loose and no ceremony at all, because there had been no time for ceremony, and because she had heard, in the space of the 4 minutes it took a running footman to reach her, 3 words that had brought her out of her rooms without stopping for anything: "Your daughter, the gate." She did not go first to the officials. She did not go to the warrant, or to Marrow, or to the keeper of the Privy Seal waiting to lay the whole grim business before her. She crossed the court, past all of it, past the great officer of her household standing white and silent under guard, and she went to the foot of the wall, and she looked up at her small straight daughter in the thrown-on coat, and she said, not as a queen, as a mother, in a voice that cracked right across the middle of it, "Maelin, come down to me now, my love. It's Mama. You can come down now." And the princess looked, before she moved, at Sergeant Halbrook. She looked at him first. 8 years old, on a cold wall, her mother's arms open below her, and she looked, before she took a single step, at the old sergeant to check. And Halbrook, who had told her not to come down for any person or any paper until the Queen came and took her hand herself, gave her the smallest nod, permission and release, and said, "Now, Your Highness, go to your mother." And she went. She came down the wall stair fast and unqueenly and half falling and into the Queen's arms, and the Queen went down on her knees on the wet cobbles of a service court in her night-clothes with her child crushed against her, and for a little while there was no sovereign and no household and no scheme and no warrant in that court. There was only a mother on the ground holding her daughter, and around them 9 king's guards standing very straight and looking hard at the middle distance, the way men do when they will not let themselves weep on duty. I looked at Sergeant Halbrook. He was not looking at the Queen and the child. He was looking at Sir Aldous Marrow, and I understood that for Halbrook the morning was not over, that the child was safe now, yes, but a thing had been attempted here that went far beyond one great officer and one forged paper, and that the still gray-eyed man beside me had already moved on in his patient way to the next question, which was not who but why, and not why but for whom. Because Halbrook did not believe and told me so, that Sir Aldous Marrow had thought of this alone. Here is the thing about a man who runs a family's movements like a clock. He is a servant. A superb, powerful, indispensable servant, but a servant, and servants, however grand, do not usually wake one morning and decide all on their own to seize the heir's little sister from her bed. They do it for someone. They do it because someone above them wants a thing done, and cannot be seen to want it, and has found in the loyal, ambitious, endlessly capable controller of household progresses the perfect instrument. A man with the keys, the routes, the timings, the ambulances, and most valuable of all, a lifetime's habit of moving the royal family about without ever being questioned. The question then was, for whom? And Halbrook had already, in his 11 days of watching, begun to answer it, though he had told no one, because a sergeant does not accuse the great on a suspicion. He had noticed who came to see Sir Aldous Marrow. Over the autumn, on the odd evenings, Halbrook stood a late watch at the lodge gate as well as the dawn watch at the water gate. He had seen a particular car come, more and more often, to the private door of the controller's apartments in the east wing. It was a good car and a discreet one, and it belonged, the gate book recorded every plate, and Halbrook read the gate book the way other men read the racing pages, to Lord Faring. Marcus, Lord Faring, Baron of the Second Creation, a cousin of the late king, a man some way down the line of the family but not so far down as he wished to be, and a man with, it was quietly known, spectacular debts and a spectacular resentment of the branch of the family that sat above him. Lord Faring was, in the order of succession, behind Queen Saralind and behind Prince Joran, and behind by exactly one small dark-haired 8-year-old girl, Princess Maelin. "Take away the girl," Halbrook said to me over the tea in his flat voice, "and you do not move Lord Faring up the line by very much, but you move him. And more than that, this was the true of it, ensign, the ugly true heart of it, more than that, you begin. You establish that a child of that house can be declared unwell, of the nerves and the blood, and quietly put away in a private clinic where a hired physician says what he is paid to say. You establish the machinery. A machinery that takes away one small princess this morning can take away a prince some other morning. Faring did not need Maelin dead. He is not, whatever else he is, a murderer. He needed her removed, declared frail, kept somewhere doubtful, a shadow over her fitness, a question over the whole senior line, and himself standing ready, the sober, responsible cousin, when the questions grew loud enough. It is a slower poison than the other kind. But it is a poison, and it starts always with taking away the smallest and least able to speak for herself. None of this could Halbrook prove that cold morning in the court. What he could prove, what the wet ink and the empty ambulance and the bed restraints in the store and the forged Queen's hand had already proven, to any eye that would look, was that Sir Aldous Marrow had come with an unlawful warrant to take a child who was not sick. That was enough to stop the morning. It was not yet enough to reach the man behind the man. And Halbrook, being who he was not content to stop the morning. He meant to reach the whole length of the thing. So while the Queen knelt in the court with her daughter, and the keeper of the Privy Seal stood turning the forged warrant in his old hands, Sergeant Halbrook did a quiet, deliberate, and slightly outrageous thing. He walked, without asking anyone's leave, to the black car at the edge of the light, and he opened the door Sir Aldous Marrow had come out of, and he leaned in, and he took from the seat the thing he had been almost certain would be there. A blotter. A small leather traveling blotter, the kind a careful man keeps to dry his correspondence, and pressed into its clean white sheet, in soft, ghostly reverse, mirror-written but perfectly legible to anyone who held it to the light, was the fresh impression of the last thing that had been blotted on it, which was a signature, which was, reversed and ghostly and utterly damning, Saralind. He had signed the warrant in the car. He had blotted it in the car, to hurry the drying, because he had known. He was not a fool, Sir Aldous Marrow. He was very far from a fool. That wet ink was a danger. And in his haste and his cleverness, he had blotted the Queen's forged name onto his own traveling blotter, and left the blotter on the seat, and forgotten it, because you cannot think of everything. And the one thing the clockmaker had never had to plan for was a sergeant who would not be hurried. Halbrook carried the blotter, holding it flat and careful by the edges, to the keeper of the Privy Seal, and he laid it beside the warrant in the strengthening light. And the two signatures, the wet one on the warrant, the ghost one on the blotter, the same hand, the same forged royal name, blotted one from the other minutes before at the edge of a service court, lay there together for every official eye to see. The keeper of the Privy Seal looked at them for a long moment. Then he looked up at Sergeant Halbrook, and something moved in the old lawyer's terrible face that I can only call awe, and he said, very quietly, "Sergeant, how long have you known?" "I haven't known anything, sir," said Halbrook. "A guard doesn't know. I've watched for 11 days, and I've kept my orders this morning, and I've asked the questions the orders let me ask. The knowing is for you and Her Majesty. I only held the gate." "You only held the gate," the keeper repeated, and he shook his bald head slowly. "Yes, I believe that is exactly what you did." The rest, the household did swiftly, and with the cold thoroughness of a great institution that has had a knife slipped toward its heart and means to be sure it has drawn out the whole blade. Sir Aldous Marrow, when he understood that the blotter had betrayed him, and that there would be no talking round the wet ink and the empty ambulance and the ghost of the forged name, did the last calculation of his career, and it was a shrewd one. He saw that he was finished, wholly and beyond saving, and that the only thing left in the world he could trade was the name of the man he had done it for. So he traded it. Sitting on an upturned crate in the strengthening light, with his gold chain of office already lifted from around his neck, and lying coiled on a guardsman's palm like a caught snake, he told the keeper of the Privy Seal, in a dead, flat voice, the whole of it. The debts of Lord Faring, and the long, patient courtship of himself by Faring's people, and the plan the clinic bought, the physician bought, the condition of the nerves and the blood invented and papered, the warrant to be forged fresh so that no one could say it was stale, the removal to be done before dawn through the one small gate where nothing ever happened, and the princess, once removed, to be kept and doubted and made frail in the eyes of the realm until the great slow poison did its work. It is a measure of how nearly it worked that, when I write it out like that, it still frightens me. There was no violence in it. No one was to be hurt. That was the horror of the thing. It was gentle and lawful-looking and paper-clean, and it would have taken a frightened child out of her mother's house at dawn with everyone's signatures in a row, and by the time anyone thought to question it, she would have been a month gone, and a doctor would have been shaking his head sadly, and the machinery would have been running, and there would have been nothing at all, to point to and call a crime. It failed for one reason, and one reason only. It failed because it had to pass a gate, and at the gate there was a man who looked at the shine of ink instead of the size of a seal. Lord Faring was taken that same day, not dragged. The great are not dragged but visited by grave men and asked to come, and he came because the machinery of the state, once it turns its full weight upon a man, does not need to drag. The forged warrant, the blotter, the bought physician's certificate found in the oxblood case, the bed restraints in the store, the hired ambulance with its plain white sides, the driver's confession, and above all Sir Aldous Marrow's flat dead recital. It was a rope of many strands, and Lord Faring, for all his blood and all his cunning, could not cut a single one of them. He denied it at first grandly. He stopped denying it when they showed him the blotter. There is no denying a ghost of your own scheme pressed into a servant's leather. Dr. Pettigore, who had never in his life examined the child whose illness he had sworn to, was struck from the register of physicians before the month was out and went before the law with the rest, his fruity carrying voice much quieter by then. The driver of the ambulance, who had put both his hands on the wheel where everyone could see them, turned out to be a hired man who had believed, or made himself believe, that he was carrying a genuinely sick child for a genuine clinic. The court took a milder view of him than of the others, and he was, in the end, more used than guilty, and I have always been glad of that, because there is a difference between the men who build a wicked machine and the men they feed into it, and it matters that a court can tell them apart. Both of the great men went, in the end, before the law, the real law, the courts, in the slow, grinding, proper way, and were tried, and were found to have done what they had done and were sentenced to it. I will not weary you with the years. The point is not the years. The point is that a scheme to seize a princess, built over months by clever, powerful men and papered until it looked like the crown's own kindness, was stopped dead at a service gate in under an hour, and unraveled to its last thread by nightfall, because one still man asked why the ink was not dry. The household did not let it rest at the punishment of the guilty. That is the mark of a good house, I have come to think. Not that wrong is never attempted against it, for wrong will always be attempted against anything worth guarding, but what the house does the morning after. Within the week, the office of the Controller of Household Progresses was taken apart and rebuilt, and a rule was made that no single officer, however trusted, might ever again arrange the movement of a child of the family alone and in secret. That every such movement required two hands that did not answer to each other, and the knowledge of the child's own household, and above all the plain waking word of the mother or the father, given aloud that morning to a face they knew. They called it a reform. Sergeant Halbrook, when I told him of it years later, only grunted, and said that a family that needed a rule to make it tell its own guards where it was taking its own children had troubles no rule would cure. But he was pleased, I think, under the grunt. It was his morning, made permanent. It was the shine of the ink written into the standing orders of a kingdom. I said I would tell you how the morning ended, and I have taken a long way round to it. And now I will end where the morning ended, which was quietly, as the true things always are. By 7 o'clock the sun was properly up. The black car was gone, driven off by a guardsman to a place where such things are kept for evidence. The ambulance was gone the same way, its empty belly photographed and measured, its plain white sides a thing that would be spoken of at the trial. The household had withdrawn indoors to the great grim business of what comes after. The Queen had carried her daughter inside herself, wrapped in the coat, the princess's dark head on her shoulder, and at the door I saw this. I was near the door, the Queen had stopped and turned, and looked back across the emptying court at Sergeant Halbrook, and had not said anything, because there was nothing that could be said in a courtyard full of ears that would be equal to it. She had only looked at him, a long steady look, mother to guard, and inclined her head, not the small nod a sovereign gives a servant, but a deep, slow, deliberate bow of the head, the bow you give an equal, the bow you give a man to whom you owe a thing that cannot be paid, and then she had carried her child indoors. And Sergeant Halbrook had come back to his post. That is the part I have never been able to make people understand, when they want the story to end with medals and speeches. There were medals, later, and there were speeches, and I will come to them. But that morning, when it was all over, when the great men had gone into their great business, and the Queen had carried the princess to safety, and the whole vast machinery of the household had swung into motion to hunt down the last of the plot. That morning, Sergeant Elias Halbrook walked back to the middle of the East Water Gate and squared his boots on the wet cobbles and slung his rifle and stood his post. There was an hour left of his watch. He stood it. He stood it exactly as he had stood the beginning of it, before the black car came, still and square and gray-eyed, and giving no sign at all that anything in the world had happened. And I stood beside him, 19 years old and shaking now that it was over, the way you shake after and not during, and I did not know what to say to him, and so I said the foolish young thing that was in my heart, which was, "Sergeant, how did you dare? He had the seal. He had the chain. You could have lost everything." And Sergeant Halbrook was quiet for so long I thought he would not answer at all, which was his way. Then he said, still facing forward, still watching the empty court where nothing was ever supposed to happen, "A seal is a thing men trust so they don't have to look, ensign. The chain is a thing men obey so they don't have to think. My whole trade is the looking and the thinking that other men are excused. That's all a guard is. Everyone else gets to trust the seal. I'm the one who has to look at the ink." He was quiet again. Then more quietly still, the only time in 3 weeks or in the years after that I ever heard him say a thing about himself. And she checked. Every morning she checked I was there. A man can lose a great deal, ensign, and it doesn't come to much. But you cannot let a child check that you are there and then not be there. That's the one thing you cannot lose. Everything else is only a pension. Then he stood the rest of his watch and said no more. And at the changing of the guard he was relieved in the ordinary way, and he saluted, and he went to his breakfast. I told you there were medals and speeches, and there were. They gave Sergeant Halbrook the highest thing the household can give a guard, which is a thing with a Latin name and a ribbon the color of old blood, and they gave it to him in the great hall with the whole watch drawn up in the family present. And the citation, read out by the master of the household in a voice that filled the hall, spoke of vigilance, and of loyalty, and of a guard who had, by his steadiness, preserved the person of a princess of the blood against an unlawful seizure. Halbrook stood for it as he stood for everything, and when it was pinned on him he looked, if anything, faintly embarrassed, a man enduring a fuss. But the thing I remember from that day is not the medal. It is what the Queen did, which was not in the program, and which the master of the household had plainly not expected, because I saw his eyebrows go up. When the citation was read and the medal pinned, Queen Saralind rose from her chair, and she stepped down from the low dais, which a sovereign does not do, and she crossed the hall to where Sergeant Halbrook stood, and beside her, holding her hand in a proper dress now and with her dark hair brushed and ribboned, walked Princess Maelin. The Queen said to the whole hall in a clear voice, "The household thanks Sergeant Halbrook, but the thanks the household gives is a formal thing, and what he did was not formal, and I will not let it pass with only a formal thanks." She looked down at her daughter. "Maelin, you wish to say something to the sergeant. Say it now in front of everyone so that everyone hears it and no one ever forgets it." And the princess, 8 years old, in front of the whole assembled watch and the family and the great officers of the household, did not say the sweet small thing you might expect a child to say. She had thought about it. You could see she had thought about it. She looked up at the big, still gray-eyed man, and she said in her thin, clear, carrying voice, "You told me not to come down for any person or any paper until my mother came, and a lot of people told me to come down, and I didn't, because you said—" She paused and frowned, working out the exact truth of it, the way she worked out everything. "So I want to say I did the hard thing because you told me to, but you did the hard thing when nobody told you to, and I think that's braver. And when I'm the Queen, I'm going to make it a rule that the guards at all the gates get to look at the ink, even the Queen's ink, especially the Queen's ink." There was a silence in that great hall of a particular quality, the silence of several hundred people all deciding at once not to weep in public and mostly failing. And Sergeant Halbrook, who had stood without moving through spat threats and forged seals and the whole long terrible morning, went down slowly on one knee, a big old man in a red coat on the cold stone of the great hall, so that his gray eyes were level with the eyes of the small straight child, and he said the last words of this story, which were, "Then I have served the right house, your highness. Guard the gates, look at the ink, and be there when the small ones check." She kept her word in the end, though it took her 20 years and a crown to do it. When Maelin came to the throne, for she did come to it, in the fullness of time, a grave, watchful queen much loved by a people who never fully knew why she trusted her guards the way she did. One of the first small, quiet acts of her reign was to write into the standing orders of the watch a rule that has her name on it, and that every probationer now learns in the first week, exactly as I learned the long ring. It is not a grand rule. It is one sentence. It says that no king's guard shall ever be required to act upon any warrant order, or instrument that he has not been permitted to read in full, and to satisfy himself is true, no matter whose seal it bears, no matter whose hand has signed it, up to and including the sovereign's own. They call it in the books Maelin's rule. The guards among themselves call it something else. They call it looking at the ink. Sergeant Elias Halbrook did not live to see her crowned. He took his pension a few months after that cold morning, exactly as he had always meant to, and went to a small stone cottage a long way from any palace, and grew, I am told, extraordinary roses, and said very little to anyone, and was content. I visited him when I could across the years, for I stayed in the watch and rose in it, and it was Halbrook I always heard in my ear when a thing came to my gate that did not belong there. And it was in that cottage over that pot of tea, a sentence at a time, that I finally got the whole of the morning out of him. The 11 days of watching, the shine of the ink, the ghost on the blotter, the child who checked. The last time I saw him, he was very old, and the roses were finished for the year, and I asked him, because I had always wanted to and never dared, whether he had ever been afraid, that morning at the gate, with the great man's chain and seal and the whole weight of rank against him, and only his own 2 eyes to trust. He thought about it in his old way for a long time. Then he said, "Every minute of it, Ensign. A man who tells you he wasn't afraid at a moment like that is telling you he didn't understand the moment. I was afraid the whole time." He looked out at the finished roses. But fear is only a kind of weather. You don't argue with it and you don't obey it. You stand your post in it the same as you stand your post in the rain, and you keep looking at the ink. A pause. That's all courage ever was, Ensign. It's not the not being afraid. It's the looking at the ink anyway. He died that winter quietly in his sleep, an old man among his roses, and they buried him with his blood-colored ribbon and a great many guardsmen present. And the Queen Maelin by then came, which sovereigns do not do for sergeants, and stood at the graveside a long time, and afterward wrote in her own hand, and let it be printed, a single line that is carved now on a small plain stone in the wall beside the east water gate, where the milk vans come, and the flower carts, and where, if you know to look, a small dark-haired girl once stood each morning, and checked that a certain man was at his post. The line reads, "He looked at the ink." That is the whole of it. That is how a courtier ordered a young princess seized, at a small gate before dawn, with every paper stamped and every signature in place, and how a still old man with barely 900 words in him refused the order, and asked why the ink was not dry, and by that one quiet question held the only gate that mattered, and kept a child safe, and taught a future queen the one law her guards will keep forever. I was there. I was 19. I rang the bell. And I have spent the rest of my life trying to be, at my own gates, the man he was at his, the one who looks at the ink.